So I am delighted today to be talking to Valentin Gerlier. Hi there, Valentin.
Mark, pleasure to see you.
Hey, look, we met on the Temenos Academy 2-year Introduction to the Perennial Philosophy, which I cannot praise highly enough. And you were teaching me Plato. And I thought today that we might range over Plato to maybe via Nicholas of Cusa to Shakespeare, because in a way the thing that prompted our conversation today was your book, Shakespeare and the Grace of Words, but then also William Blake, because we were talking the other week and I know that we're both getting into William Blake as well. So look, to sort of follow that golden string through those figures.
I should just say it's very generous of you, Mark, to say that I was teaching you Plato, since when we met, you had already finished your PhD, which was in fact on Plato. So maybe we're just teaching one another.
But this is the point, actually, just to leap straight in, because I did do a PhD on Plato, and yet I felt I didn't really begin to get a sense of what was really going on when I was trying to read Plato. And it wasn't just your class, but your class did really help crystallize that sense of things. So the reason I said it wasn't just your class, that wasn't very generous, was because I was also reading at the same time Owen Barfield in Saving the Appearances, where he makes this remark that someone might read the whole of Plato and even write books about him, he says, and not have understood a single word. And so when we began your class and you immediately said, look, there's key words that we have to unthink before we can really begin to get a sense of what Plato might be going at, I thought, now this is where I need to be. And so it really was a kind of a joy and a delight. And just to open up a bit more about what was going on there, you've used this phrase before, Leonard Cohen's line from the famous song Alleluia, which is, there's a blaze of light in every word. And there's something that I wonder whether that might be a bit of a thread now, because I think one of the things which I loved about the way you taught Plato was that you, if I might put it like this, realized that Plato is a true teacher in that he's trying to invoke something in us rather than just tell us what's the case. And that was such a relief to me to hear, because through this PhD in a good department of philosophy, but it had been broadly shaped by an Anglo-analytic approach to philosophy, which was sort of treating it almost like a science, as if it was trying to prove something objective.
Yes. And
through reason and logic, and there is a part of that in Plato. Plato can do reason as well as anybody, and actually better than pretty much anybody. But nonetheless, that's not the point. That's not the telos. It is to invoke something in the reader through these dialogical engagements. And you understood that. So, do you want to pick up that first sort of strand of this string?
You've kind of said it perfectly, better than I could. I think one of the challenges, one of the things that really opened up Plato's dialogues for me, where once I understood that in contacting texts that are a little bit ancient, say a kind of from a kind of pre-modern tradition, you have to, it really is an adventure. You have to leap into a cosmos that is quite different to ours. And one of the big differences, I think, is this sense that the whole adventure of language is a sort of is a kind of participatory journey, rather than an analytical one where you discuss propositions and decide whether they may be true or false or ambiguous and so on. And I think in this older view of language and language's relationship to the real, there is an implicit sense that language participates in the real, and that therefore to enter the adventure of language is to enter a journey into the heart of reality. And so, as you say, part of that is to exercise one's reason. But I think in Plato's dialogues, the kind of reason is not the end point, but actually helps you clarify and illuminate some things that are actually beyond reason, or the goal of reason, or the heart even of reason. So there's a kind of a world which is, let's just say, multivocal or even analogical. It's an analogical reality rather than a univocal, horizontal world where words either mean the same thing or mean something very, very different. Once I got that there was play in the way that Plato used language, it's just started to open for me in a very, very different way. And then the other obvious fact is that, actually, talking about play, those dialogues are plays. Plato virtually never appears. I mean, he gets mentioned once or twice, but he's usually absent or sick or whatnot. So whatever Plato's trying to do happens through other characters. So straight away, we're entering a kind of theatrical, dramaturgic world where really the kinds of things that happen in theatre happen as we contact the dialogues on the page. So that's great, because then that gets you out of thinking about propositional language as propositional, or those dialogues as just being didactic. It's just that, oh, what's going on here? It's a work of art, really, that's unfolding, not a treatise of what Plato thinks about the world. That for me was hugely liberating. And ever since, I think I've been attracted to artists or philosophers or mystics or what have you that have got that sort of literary bent to them. And it was very liberating to contact Plato in that way.
Yeah, I love that Plato, I think he appears 3 times, twice in one dialogue and then once in another. And he is like, so one time it's in the Phaedo, and it sort of says that he was at the door and left. I love that. But do you know, another text that helped me make sense of that actually was Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own.
Yes.
Because in the latter part of that book, she talks about Shakespeare and how Shakespeare had sort of got over any need to make a point, to act a vengeance, to make his mark in the world, and so disappeared into his work. And then the whole of life could flow through his work as a result.
Yes.
And I think she could have said the same for Plato, actually. It's not just him being modest or something. There really is a truth that he and his words, and then this form, the dialogical form, the plays, they're completely in the service of this greater end. Which is why, another way of putting it is, that's one of the reasons why we're still reading them 2,500 years on, is that they are inspired and continue to inspire. Absolutely.
There's another thing that Plato and Shakespeare have in common that I really am interested in, is the unfinishedness. That actually the dialogue sets out with one particular question, and most of the time ends with an aporia or an opening onto another question, or new insights that kind of, it's taking us somewhere where perhaps at the beginning we weren't sure it was going to take us. And I think with the same with Shakespeare, there's even the comedies, which should notoriously be a comedy, is traditionally ends in a moment of great social union or reconciliation. But even those moments in Shakespeare, the sort of endings of the play, leave openings and leave a kind of something unfinished, thus portraying, I think, the nature of the infinite in finite terms, as it were. And that's the real dialogical universe that I love. It's just that's
very brilliant. How the infinite can be conveyed in the finite. Look, I mean, we'll come back to more on Shakespeare, but just a couple more reflections on Plato. I mean, that's because the aporia is a pregnant silence. It's the sense that something is now present that wasn't before.
Yes.
And that's what is shared if you've had the Socratic education. I mean, I think this is so crucial because it's so rarely understood amongst professional philosophers, I think. It's beginning to come back, actually, that there's sometimes a thing now called third wave third wave Shakespeare, third wave Platonism.
Mm.
And there's a few writers who are realizing this and almost rescuing Plato from the academy. And one of the things I think they're realizing is in this area. But it's so crucial because if even the dialogues that don't have the aporia at the end, there's something vital about the exploration being the point, not the conclusion that's reached. And this is so crucial because otherwise people get these tragic summaries of Plato, like he was against poets, or he would have banned this, or he was an armchair tyrant, as Karl Popper put in, because of what he said in the Republic. And it's so strange because if you read the Republic, there are actually 3 accounts of possible policies that kind of rise and fall, and then another one rises and falls, another one, and you if you actually read it and didn't just treat the drama as a kind of gloss to help sugar the pill of the philosophy, which is sort of how people treat Plato, it might make you think again and think, look, there's something else going on here. Which I guess is that certainly in the Republic you could summarize it as the project to build the city that is a sort of portal to the heavenly city, both inwardly in the individual soul and collectively in this time of ours, a temporal reality, the finite reality. That's got to be a continual project. It can't ever come to a standstill, otherwise it just becomes its finite self.
Absolutely.
So if you have this flow and dynamism that's in the dialogues, in the play, is also his trying to direct us in that's how we should live too, actually.
Yes, I think that's beautifully said. I think the Republic, the dialogue of the Republic is the Republic, in the sense that all the kind of subtleties and colors and educational moments where the characters that usually say, there's usually sort of Socrates yes men suddenly kind of are enthusiastic about something or worried about something else. These are kind of key, crucial moments where the kind of energy, the life and energy of the dialogue kind of displays itself. And it really is, for me, it is really a kind of a movement of a kind of dialogical friendship, where, as you say, the exploration is the thing itself. It is making the thing present. And the thing that is being made present, this kind of Republic, which is really should be, a kind of common friendship with a common dedication to the good, is kind of, as it is being invoked, it is being made present. So it isn't that the Republic is about some other thing, which is called the Republic, and let's discuss, let's have an Excel spreadsheet, how we might, sort out what a Republic looks like. The actual performing of it, the actual unfolding of it is that. And it's perplexing for that very reason, because it's unfinished and it's slippery, and you can feel its presence at some point, and then there's some obscurity, and then there's some contradiction, and then there's difficulties, but that is the nature of the Republic as it unfolds. And I think in general we've lost this dimension of presence in these great and strange works that we love to ponder, like the Republic. We're so concerned with the meaning and the thoughts, where's he leading there? Like, can you sum this bit up? And we're actually, we've been desensitized to simply the presence of the unfolding of the dialogue as itself having some a meaningful spiritedness. And I think that's a really important aspect that you have to bring back in reading Plato. I think that actually is fundamental to the Platonic literature.
Yeah, well, look, let's hope it's beginning to return. Actually, there's a very short introduction, that OUP series. I think it was the one on Plato. There might even be one on the Republic, actually. And I'm trying, off the top of my head, to remember the very great, actually, ancient Greek scholar who wrote it. I can't remember her name. I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
But she actually makes the point. She tracks the history of the reception of the Republic and notices that it was during the period of British Empire that it started getting read as a kind of manifesto.
Mm.
You know, you need to go out across the world and become the philosopher kings. No mention of the philosopher queens, of course, either. But nonetheless, this was, you know, a crucial point in its transformation, almost sort of killing it dead. But, you know, maybe that's one of the things which, you know, as time continues, we're able to sort of return to an older sense of reading and make sense of it again once more.
Yeah. And I think also this sense that, you know, this kind of disembodied skeletal form of Platonism where there's supposed to be these transcendent forms floating about in some different world. I think that's very unhelpful. And I actually don't really think that's in the tradition, that's in the literature. Of course, some people have read Plato like that over the centuries, but in essence, I sense that the famous transcendentals of goodness and truth and beauty are obviously, again, present as they show up. So the way that Socrates speaks with his friends and slash students, Glaucon and Adeimantus, there's a showing of goodness there. The good is actually being embodied in the dialogue, in and through the dialogue, and it's not just this abstract principle that you're meant to gesture towards as though there were these two completely separate worlds that are unconnected.
Yeah, no, someone once made the remark to me that the forms, the theory, I remember this was one of the words which you said, we just need to pause when we use that word because it's more an act of contemplation than a proposition to test, is perhaps well thought of as a kind of myth. And let's tell this story of the forms in various ways, which of course Plato does. There's not one standard version of the forms. It appears in different ways in different dialogues, but that's the whole point.
Yes.
He wasn't reaching for the settled theory. What he was doing was say, this maybe is a useful way, again, to invoke this sense of the transcendentals, what we now call the transcendentals. And so help us discern when the good does show up, discern when we're being drawn by beauty.
Yes.
And I found that a very helpful way of putting it.
Yeah, to make the soul attentive and sensitive to those crucial moments where it can really learn and possibly be transformed. So it's really a practical manual, I think, for the education of the soul rather than some abstract disembodied thing like it has become.
And that's why it's got these different forms in it. You know, there is rational bits. There's the famous myth of the cave and other more mythological material. Then there's this, you know, ends with this near-death experience. And I think it's unless you have this richer account of what's going on, it just seems this strange assortment of bits and bobs, you know, which then you extract the bits you can't make sense of and try and go for the rational heart of it, which of course has lost the heart of it in the process. Exactly. Anyway, look, we've made that point, but maybe we can just move on. And when I read your book, Shakespeare and the Grace of Words, there's a lot of richness in it, and partly because at one point I actually spent quite a lot of time with The Winter's Tale, A Winter's Tale, which is one of the plays you talk about. But the moments that was a real joyful revelation for me, actually, was the section where you bring in Nicholas of Cusa, this Renaissance cardinal, philosopher, mystic, becoming a bit better known again, I think, now. But he had this brilliant way of addressing what had happened maybe in between our time and Plato's time that causes this difficulty for us with words, thinking they're primarily about defending propositions or communicating information rather than being vehicles, to remember Leonard Cohen again, through which we can feel this blaze of light. Yes. Do you want to say something about Nicholas of Cusa? And I mean, I have my sort of pat summary of it, which may or may not be helpful, but
I mean, I think you said some really good things there. I'm trying to think about what you say. He is a liminal figure. He is really between two worlds, I think, between the kind of ancient world that I've been talking about and the modern world, I think, in which we live today. We're talking about 15th century, I think. I'm very bad with dates, but I think that's about right. And in a sense, I think he's so interesting because he wants to keep something about the older worldview that is a kind of the sense in which language and reality are united, the sense in which the universe is intuitively felt as meaningful. And at the same time, he wants to do justice to the modern insight of understanding the cosmos as infinite, you know. So there's a movement away from a kind of medieval worldview in which there's a very, let's just say, I'm going to simplify things, a very kind of top-down or bottom-up version of reality in which things are beautifully described, say in something like Dante's Divine Comedy, but they can also feel a little bit static. And I think that the insight of modernity, of the philosophers, the scientists, the astronomers and whatnot, was to realize that actually our world is within a kind of horizontal infinity, not just a vertical one. So I think Cusa is interesting in that he wants to keep the vertical sense and wants to do justice to these kind of new horizontal insights. But at the same time, I think in his period, there's a kind of there's a sort of nihilism that has crept in, and some certain theological currents have made it so that it becomes increasingly difficult to understand really how the divine is connected to the human or to the material. And one of the I think real difficulties that he tries to push against is this theological current that is known as voluntarism, which basically purely out of, I think, a need to take theology out of the ivory towers of universities and re-emphasize the importance of daily practice and faith, had posited this God that was so powerful and so great that really nothing about God's being could be understood with the reason. It had all to be accepted via revelation, and you should really focus on your daily kind of devotional life. So what, you know, kind of all the theologians, like say someone like Thomas Aquinas, had tried to weave together, which is this intricate relationship between the human mind and the divine mind, between matter and spirit, if you will, in this kind of older way, that was really being torn apart. And as a result, you had all these really very strange things that this ancient doctrine that you know, in the beginning was the word, kind of validated, if you will, that somehow logos infuses the entire creation, and therefore there is a sense in which word and real are kind of subtly touching one another at all times. That was really being lost, and there was a kind of impoverishing the sense that language could really reveal anything other than repeat what Revelation said. So increasingly people started to talk about the finite and the infinite on the same terms. So the divine just became just a very, very great being with lots of powers. Whereas in the older worldview, you could speak about the divine, but obviously what you were saying would be metaphoric, symbolic, poetic. So there would be a kind of relationship between what you would say and what you were saying, what you were speaking to or about. But it would be understood not to be literal. So that was really in a bit of a mess when he was writing. I think the key insight that I picked up on, Mark, in the book is this kind of late insight that, late in Cusa's career, this sense that he developed that really through the act of praising, there was a mode of revealing or cognizing or understanding something about the divine that simple propositional language cannot do. So because by praising, by affirming the goodness of being, we are also discovering how the divine, how God sees the creation. So there's a connection between, if we go back to the Bible, it really begins with God kind of creating stuff by speaking, And the moment he speaks, he sees the goodness. You know, there's always these passages saying, and he saw that it was good. And then he creates this other thing and he saw that it was good. So I really picked up on this dynamic between speaking and seeing. And I realized that that was in Cusa. That's what he was saying, that in a sense, when one's kind of expression, and I don't just mean simple verbal expression, I mean the expression of one's whole being, kind of affirms the goodness of things, somehow mysteriously, you can see an aspect of their real being. And that's the unique power of the language of praise that the other kinds of languages don't quite have. So once I connect, so this was Cusa's, one of Cusa's little solutions to deal with what had happened in the Middle Ages, this loss of confidence in what we could say about the divine, this loss of connection between language and the real and language and God. So looking at praise was one of the ways that he addressed. And by doing that, one last thing, he reconnected what theologians and philosophers do, which is reflecting on things, and the simple daily life of devotion. So all of a sudden, those two things were reconnected, because praise is what we're both doing, whether we're a philosopher or whether in our daily prayers, or even simply saying, this is a beautiful sunrise. In all these cases, we are revealing something of this divine vision. So it was a kind of nifty solution to a difficult cultural problem that he was experimenting with.
Yes, and I want to come on to why that's relevant to Shakespeare. But just to, I hope amplify that in another thing that's quite a feature of Cusa is these analogies that he has. One of my favorites is the spinning top, where he talks about how the funny thing about a spinning top is that the faster and faster it spins, the more stable it becomes.
Yes.
And so this is an image in infinity of as it were, the many, the moving, reaching the one, the unity, and yes. The infinitely spinning top, in which there's points on the surface of the spinning top, if you like, but when it's spinning infinitely, all those points are one point. Yes. And because of the movement, that's where the stability lies. Yes. And the thing about these analogies is not just you go, oh yes, that sort of, it sort of logically makes sense. It's in the moment of revelation that the analogy brings, so that the spinning top is itself a moment of praise. And that kind of aha, that sense of delight that comes with the image and the realization that the image brings. I guess that's an act of praise too.
Yes, absolutely. And in those instances, exactly, it's an act of praise. It's this aha moment. And of course, there's this real interest for a kind of, let's just say, a kind of paradoxical way of thinking, or the kind of bringing the union of contraries, which is something that interests Blake, of course, as well. But in bringing together these two contraries, like in the spinning top, or in his excellent definition of God as the not other, it forces, in a way, the mind to be kind of childishly alert to something wondrously true, and yet something that the laws of reason, the kind of Aristotelian laws of reason, the law of the excluded middle, and all these kind of basic logical laws that found the way in which found the way in which we think in binary terms, suddenly are not exploded, but transmuted for a moment. So it's just a wonderful way it's kind of a playful way, of taking reason to these lovely moments of where you just have to subtly leave it behind. But it's taken you there, but you have to leave it behind.
And that's what I got from the way you wrote about it as well, was that Cusa wasn't sort of backing off from what was unfolding, the early sense of modernity, but saying, no, we must go through it. And that's why, he's so actually crucial. You talked about voluntarism, the other big ism that sometimes was said to have led to the modern sense of things is nominalism. And that can be described in a number of ways, but quite a helpful way, a bit of a shorthand, nominalism has to do with names. And, actually they were often Franciscans that had sort of undone the connection between names and reality, and said, well, look, names are just arbitrary. They don't participate in what they're describing at all. That's why there's so many of them, and they just seem so random. If you look in different languages, you know, there's different names for the same thing. So how can there be a participation or association? And Cusa comes along and says, no, it's precisely that myriad names that is expressing the falling of the infinite, you might say, into infinite things. It's precisely what we should expect, that to be this kind of riot almost of names, a play again of names. And I love that he goes straight through the middle of the problem and out the other side is a kind of return, a remembrance. And so he's vital, actually, for the meaning crisis that we find ourselves in now.
Yes, absolutely. I really like that. And you're right, he does... Instead of reverting to a strict traditionalism, you're right, he radicalizes the modern. I think he does that several times in his work. But I think with the nominalism, you're absolutely right. He says, okay, well, let's take this issue of the arbitrariness of language and let's just, as you said, go through it. Let's see where it actually leads. Let's not just kind of keep to an ideology of, no, names are arbitrary. That's it. We've decided. Let's just see what the consequences of that are. And for him, the consequences of that are that you return to your universal. And actually, in his work, there's this kind of dynamic marriage of the natural names and the arbitrary names. And one of the solutions that he explores, if I can call it a solution, is art, is crafting, it's making. In the moment of, and this is why I'm so interested in terms of poetics, because in the moment of artistically even making something with all the intent, the attention and the craft that requires, you come upon something that ineffably has a connection to a universal name, even though it is an arbitrary name that you yourself have created. So this is beginning to a theme that becomes very explicit in Blake, and I guess it would be there in Shakespeare. But the idea that we're called to a kind of co-creation with the original creation, and that's another really important dynamic in. I don't know if you can talk about the return or the remembrance, the recollection of the universal in the particular. It's not just the sort of passive I see. Again, it's this sense of stepping in and making, being involved in the poiesis. And so it calls our consciousness to be part of this. The activity of the soul really matters in this restoration. That's right. And in that, I think he's in line with kind of all the mystical traditions, all the mystical traditions that have always kind of touched upon the paradoxical nature of ourselves. We are both ourselves and something else as well. There is a kind of human divine phenomenon that is the essence of ourselves, and that kind of that shows up as well in language, because his whole point was that in a way the Middle Ages had got a bit static with equating God to being. And what he's really trying to say is God isn't just being. God is being and everything that is able to be. So God is the marriage of potentiality and actuality, and it's the mysterious tie between the two. So the infinite, this at once frees all the artists, because suddenly the co-creative potential of the soul is given an open rein as kind of co-creators of reality. Of course, that comes also with tremendous responsibility. But all of a sudden, you've got a universe that moves. That it's not just a static cathedral-esque kind of structure, but there's something that expands, to use another Blakean term, infinitely. And the marriage between those two things, between rest and motion, between potential and actual, and between nature and art, that's the center really of that kind of dynamic thinking. And that's you're right, and that is really the crucial insight, I think, that can be brought back now.
I feel it's so necessary too, because if you care about mystical traditions and even, you know, hoping to live a visionary life, that it's an activity, I think, is really important, because it can be presented so much as a sort of passive, you know, stepping back, you know, words like detachment and so on, I think start to be very misunderstood. But this stepping into life, embrace of the many things. Again, you know, it's in Blake. It's you know, heaven is seen in a wild flower, a world in a grain of sand, and all that. The minute particulars matter. But look, let's do a bit of Shakespeare before enjoying praising Blake, because so you in your book you talk particularly about King Lear and about A Winter's Tale, and can you tell me something about that? Because I confess, when I rather used A Winter's Tale because I wrote a book about friendship at one point, and I wanted a bit of Shakespeare on friendship, and so I talked about the friendship between the two men in A Winter's Tale, and used it probably in a rather ethical way, almost to illustrate what can go wrong in friendship, because things go terribly wrong there. But you do something, you know, much richer and more expansive with the story of A Winter's Tale. Anyone who knows it knows that it ends with this seemingly strange thing, which is the statue coming back to life. And there's a bit of a sense, if you're not that tuned in, as I certainly haven't been, that it's a bit Deus Ex Machina. Is this some sort of magical end? You know, you take it in a much richer way. Is it possible to summarize what, say, you see in A Winter's Tale? I mean, you know, King Lear, you talk about at great length too, and that's perhaps even more complicated, but perhaps for now, A Winter's Tale.
There's so many themes in A Winter's Tale. It's easy to see it as a kind of play that is difficult to stage, and that has lots of loose ends that don't get tied up at the end, which, as we said before, is probably a good thing. I think that one of the interesting things that occurred to me when I was working in the book and reading The Winter's Tale is that the two men, for all their kind of childhood kind of friendship and connection, seem very hesitant about entering the world of intimacy and actually embodied physical love. So they've got this relationship. It seems to me that Hermione and Leontes, there's a kind of weird relationship, a slightly distanced kind of relationship where Hermione is sort of admired but not really intimately connected with. And there's a speech really at the beginning that kind of gives it away, where they talk about being boy eternal. And it's a kind of very playful speech where they're saying, you know, they're sort of making fun about, you know, how when they were boys, they were very innocent. And then they saw their future wives, and then it all went downhill from there. And there's a kind of playful yet not so playful mention of kind of original sin. And that kind of understanding of innocence as being a sort of almost like, I think I describe it as this kind of being in formaldehyde, like just, you know, protected from the dangers of experience, you know, is a very sentimental view, and therefore potentially very cruel view. And I think in the first half of the play, what unfolds is the consequences of that dangerous understanding of innocence, that all the cruelty that is behind that false understanding of materiality and intimacy and sexuality even gets kind of played out to catastrophic ends. And then it so really, in terms of the language of praise, I think that the final scene is really a scene of praising something back into life, you know, praising intimacy, praising matter, flesh, real embodied connections, which he has lost. And there's a sort of weird yet magical unfolding, a kind of you know, he's kind of taken through almost he's kind of being taught by Paulina how to invoke the beauty and goodness of the embodied material world. And through doing that, there's a sort of miracle that occurs where Hermione comes back to life. And at the same time, I think the play is typical in Shakespeare, perhaps later writings, in which he experiments with solutions to tragedy. And it seems like the tragic world is so powerful and so all permeating, as we see in King Lear, which is in some way the ultimate tragedy. And I think there's a strange return of the fabulous and the magical and the innocent in his late plays, and in a sense, the Winter's Tale really is a kind of song to innocence. Is a kind of is showing how intelligent innocence can be, as it were, and therefore it has got this fabulous coda where it seems mythical. The reality becomes infused with mythical energy. So a lot of people think that's a little bit theatrical and a bit, heavy-handed, but I actually think Shakespeare's being serious there. It's an actual experiment in understanding what it takes to go beyond the tragic, beyond the nihilism, beyond the despair.
No, it makes sense to me, and I'm really not at all knowledgeable about Shakespeare, but even as you talk just then, the figure of the statue, which could also be an idol, could be the invocation of a presence, not just the memory of a person. It's almost maybe when you're before the statue or the image, you're in an in-between space, because you are who you are with all that's happened, and in this case the tragedy that's happened, but there's a more I'm trying not to say liminal, but there's a kind of maybe another possibility might become present as well. Yes. And so when the language of praise is invoked, it becomes, I suppose, redemptive. Yes. And so there's would you even say that in the last act then the past is still present with all its loss, but right, through through the presence, a new future might be becoming possible, something like that.
Yes, the past is present with all its loss. Absolutely. That's very well said. And of course, there's the middle bit with the whole connection between Perdita, who's the daughter of Hermione, and Leontes, who has been hidden, and her kind of stepping back into life in this very pastoral, idyllic kind of context where she becomes herself a kind of living icon, if you will. She has this moment where she wears the clothes of the goddess Flora, who symbolizes, I suppose, spring and the return of kind of earthly life. Again, this theme of embodiment and materiality, and I think that's kind of key. That the lost daughter kind of returns, and without that return, the final scene kind of doesn't make full sense. I think often people look at that final scene almost in excluding that scene from the rest of the drama and thinking, well, what's going on there? What's what kind of strange ritual is being performed? I think the whole play, or at least certainly the second half of the play, performs a life-giving ritual. That's really Shakespeare's answer to the tragedy of complete nihilism that is enacted in certain parts of King Lear, and certainly in the first part of The Winter's Tale. Its language returns to its roots, so it's back to invocation, spells, songs, poetry, and the kind of the world of the ritual. Whereas in the first part of The Winter's Tale, it's very sophisticated courtly language with multiple jokes and double entendre and whatnot. And you see, it's so amazingly done. You see that completely degenerates into Leontes' completely solipsistic and murderously jealous kind of mentality that he has. So you got a play that really figures forth the downfall of language into almost non-speech, completely self-involved speech. And you get the second half of the play where Shakespeare really tries to show what is the rebirth of language? What are its roots? What really does it matter? What matters to be said? What is it that's worth saying? What is it that's worth expressing? And what's worth expressing, I think, in the second half of the play is the praise of life, the goodness of the creation. And so that's why it transforms into this dark, wintry world, into this kind of semi-fabulous spring world. Yeah.
I like too that sense of this dynamic of it's going through the darkness, that the spring can start to be felt again. It's reminding me of Dante, actually. That I need to go and check this now, but I think a lot of the sins, so-called, in the lower circles of hell are sins against words, actually. I mean, the Bolger that's particularly coming to mind are the flatterers, who are up to their neck, quite literally, in shit, because they have perverted, polluted, poisoned words in life. And then I wouldn't be surprised, this is what I need to check, whether, because you can read, Dante vertically across the three domains as well as just diachronically, and whether that corresponds to the moment where in the Paradise, Dante is before Peter, James and John and has to speak beautifully about faith, hope and love, remembering the language of praise again. And it's not a test. It's precisely, can he sing his soul into that paradisal perception that means then he can participate in the paradisal perception once more. Yes. So there's a lot of echoes here, actually.
That's really interesting.
But look, let's unless there's something burning about Blake to Dante, let's move on to Blake, because we've touched on Blake and you mentioned the word innocence there, so maybe this is a good point of contact with Blake, because well, as you said, the point about A Winter's Tale is it begins with this sentimentality which is actually cruel, as you say. I mean, that's really strong and makes me sit up, that sentimentality that might be presented as trying to be kind is actually cruel, because I suppose it takes us away from reality.
Yes.
And I think this is important when it comes to Blake, to understand that innocence for him is not a sort of abstraction or a sugarcoating of things. It's actually the stance which can embrace experience. Exactly. And so it's a movement into life. It's a saying yes, which is even why in the songs of innocence and experience, even some of the seemingly most innocent of the poems, there's always a shade of something else coming in.
Yes.
And then, in a lot of those poems, let alone later on in Blake, the contraries of innocence, experience, and the other contraries that he talks about, are trying to draw us into life, but so as to keep being able to say yes, even in the tragic moments, on the faith that life returns, something like that. Anyway,
absolutely. There's a term from the philosopher Paul Ricoeur that I really like, which is second naivete, which is really what you're talking about. The sense that it is exactly saying yes despite, saying yes even. You've traversed the world of experience. You've not shied away from it. You've gone through it and are learning from it. And somehow, despite or perhaps even because of what you're going through, you're able to affirm something of the fundamental goodness of things. So it isn't this formaldehyde thing where there's this sentimentality. When we're children, of course, you don't really know what's coming. So yes, you're playing around and being all innocent, but you just wait until the reality of life hits you. Actually, the crucial thing is entering into the world of experience, and somehow that kernel, that kind of that what we've inherited, because children they just come out of the womb of eternity. They're so close to the kind of primary light, but to keep that sense of the origin and the source, and to let it transform you and to let it grow through you, even as you pass through these difficulties. And so that makes innocence a kind of a state of it redeems experience, in other words. So the two states are contrary, but they're only contrary from a certain point of view. From another point of view, there's an innocence that generously embraces experience and still says yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and again, this I think is one of the reasons why Blake too is so important. You know, and another way of putting this, perhaps, which now I'm thinking about it, maybe links back to what we were saying about Plato. He picks up on this notion that in a parallel way that sentimentality can be cruel because it takes you from life. So I think the desire to pin things down can be cruel as well. I've heard you say about Blake that the figure of Urizen, the kind of the scientific mind in its purest form, to approach the world solely through abstractions that can be fully comprehended, completely expressed, then used to sort of manipulate the world into technology and so on. That kills life. It's deadening. It's actually destructive. This movement that tries to create stasis out of movement, and I find that again, that feels to me sort of doubly important, because it's not just saying, you know, we're all against scientism or something. You know, that's not saying anything new at all. What we're trying to say is that this desire to understand must always take us through to that which is precipitated precisely because we reach that moment where we don't understand, but we don't understand in the richest possible way, and so get this intimation of more. And yeah, that I hope that, so, you know, hence words like expand and so on are so crucial in Blake.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it is so interesting, isn't it? I think, I mean, everything you say, I need to reflect on it all now. It's funny how we're just all stumped by Blake in that way. I think, because Urizen is a figure that is at once sentimental and cruel, isn't he? He's got this, you know, he's cruel to his universe and then weeps all the time. So that, you know, Blake is so good at showing these paradoxes. And I don't think any of his characters, mythic or otherwise, are ever unidimensional. He's always aware of the contradiction between or within them. What does unleashing the Urizenic mind mean? It means that there's this kind of residue of emotion and love and generosity and truth that's gone completely unbalanced. So I think in his kind of more mythic writings, he does explore that. But I think linked to that, I think there's something. I really don't think it's helpful to be anti-science and anti-modernity. I think it's important to be astute and discerning in our relationship with the present moment. And by the way, that's why I like reading ancient texts, not because I like museum pieces, but because they help making the present strange. If you've got a generosity towards the ancient without accepting it in a kind of overly, blind way. I mean, there were all kinds of problems in the ancient world, as we know. But just that kind of dialogue between these two worlds, it suddenly makes the everyday something that really bears kind of deep questioning. And Blake, I think, was also a little bit like Shakespeare and Cusa, kind of had one step in sort of all the traditions and all the sources, but really to illuminate the present. But I think one thing that, correct me, I mean, maybe you feel different about it, Mark, but I think this kind of the sense that he had, that this sort of Urizen techno-rationality, that thing that had been unleashed, was a kind of weirdly totalizing force that is now with us. And we need to attend to what that means. And I think he found these prophetic mythical writings not just to rail against modernity and Newton, Bacon, and Locke, but really to figure forth, to put something front and center for us to see, like, this is the kind of the child of this is the energy of the culture right now. And it's all our responsibility to be alive to it, to learn about it, its hidden genius, as well as its disasters. So in a sense, Yes, so just to say, I think he is a paradoxical thinker in that sense. He understands that all these energies, even Urizen, in certain contexts, he's a hero. So I think that very open-hearted, careful, attentive, discerning, but also paradoxical imagination. So I think something that all the thinkers that we've spoken about today share.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a parallel sometimes I found helpful from psychotherapy. My day job is working as a psychotherapist, and the effort in psychotherapy to understand why things feel the way they feel isn't just an effort to recreate the past. What it is an effort to re-understand the present in the light of the past, in order that space might start to appear around the present, to kind of create a sense of difference from what's happened and what's happening now, by understanding more what's happening in both contexts, actually, so that things don't come sort of kind of crashing down onto sort of what a single vision and Newton's sleep. And so that's absolutely fundamental to the possibility of a different tomorrow. It's not just about either condemning or becoming nostalgic, because this is who we are, but precisely trying to understand the fullest extent of who we've become is the preparation, to the more returning. It's in Dante. It's descent and ascent. Well, it's in Plato. The Republic begins. Yesterday I went down to Piraeus. Plato saying the descent as well as the ascent out of the cave are part of the same action for we human beings.
Yes.
So yeah, that's one of the ways that I'm trying to wrestle with Blake. But I think also part of this recognition of what's happened in the present, which I completely agree with you, the totalizing effect of it, is strangely this amazing enterprise called science. Once it seems to exist in a closed cosmos, a closed universe, where everything can be understood through its own language. And I think, that's one of the things which Blake did understand very clearly, that a science properly understood actually is an open universe, one where the imagination isn't just a sort of handy help so that the scientist comes up with better ideas, but precisely, and you do get this strangely, often in popular science, which maybe to try and sugar the pill of difficult science does play on the wonder. So a popular science program on the telly will be full of beautiful music, and they'll fly the scientists to hilltops, to explain a little bit of physics. But really, the real work has actually been done in saying, no, we live in this open, expansive universe. And I think Blake, when he joins the hands of Bacon, Newton, and Locke with Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton, and it's when the arrows of their intellect are sort of flying through the sky, and that's really what he's leading us towards, even as he's helping us understand the dire situation that this totalizing approach can bring about too.
Because science is one thing and this kind of single vision techno-rationality is another. And the single vision, the Newton sleeps stuff is really saying that's the only vision. There are no other visions. All the other visions are vaporous. They're not what we provide. What we provide is the brute real as it is. So that ceases to be science and becomes a kind of dogmatism, which all the other forms of visions get ignored. So I think in a way, it's privileging one form of imagination at the expense of all the others. And that's, I think, that's a really big psychocultural or even psychospiritual phenomenon that he's tackling, which is different from the pure practice of science, which is poetic and imaginative and sometimes deeply personal and genius-like. I think it's worth just stressing as well that Blake wasn't against science in the sense that he was fascinated by it, and actually he was a great technologist. He invented this new form of
printing and production. And when you look at his language, he was clearly fascinated by biology in particular, because, you know, parts of the body and parts of nature. But the point is, he sees through the biological. It's not just the sort of flat surface appearance for him, but by studying, you know, the transformation of caterpillars into butterflies through the pupa stage, whatever it might be, the things he's obviously fascinated by, he sees life unfolding and revealing itself once more to him. So
and once more it comes back to this question of the intimate intertwining of the infinite and the finite, and how they both kind of are mysteriously together. And in a way, we've touched on that theme, I think, throughout the conversation, that I think what I get from Blake is to properly see the finite is actually to see the infinite within the finite, or as a feature of the finite, but that nonetheless exceeds it as well. So, and, you know, it's again this paradox of our own nature is kind of is a more than ourselves. We are more. The deeper we go into ourselves, the more we are more than ourselves. We've got this kind of excessive nature, much like the divine in a sense. And I really get this from Blake, that it isn't this sense of, here's two worlds, here's your infinite over here, and here's your material finite over there, and isn't the infinite great, and isn't the finite terrible? I mean, that's so boring. I think, you know, what he's trying to show is really how the two are kind of dance within one another and kind of exceed one another and surprise one another. But I think he seems to invite us to constantly see that, rather than just to see that and tick it off the list. And perhaps that's part of the reason why some of Blake's so difficult to read. I always find that, you know, particularly in, you know, in his latest so-called more prophetic work, I think he invites us to be alive to what he's saying, rather than to fall for a kind of monotonous poetic cadence and, oh, isn't that nice? What a lovely line. He's kind of just constantly using kind of poetic tactics to keep us awake.
Yeah, no, he sort of says that at the begining of Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Divine Album, doesn't he? He says, you know, when these words were dictated to me by the Heavenly Father, and you think, oh my goodness, you know, but I had to wrestle with the form, the meter. Was I going to be like Chaucer? Was I going to be like Shakespeare? You know, and every word I measured. So that co-creation is part of the revelation, that the infinite and the finite making contact.
And as a reader, you are participating in that co-creation, because boy, is he demanding a lot of you. He's really trying to keep us alive. So it's not the lines that, you know, they're constantly awakening your wonder. You know, what's happening now? What's he saying? Where have we gone to? You know, how come I was in London a second ago? Now I'm in this kind of heavenly Jerusalem, but hang on a minute. No, there's Cambridge. Oh, you know, you're just constantly thrown around. And I think that's just a wonderful way of keeping awake, or waking us up. He's waking up Albion, and he's waking up the reader at the same time.
Yeah, no, it's sometimes I feel that he must have been very alert to his own sort of thought processes, and as they move across dimensions of reality, you know, even in a second. Because sometimes I found that helpful to bear that in mind when I'm reading him and thinking, wait a minute, what's happened now? You know, but also just maybe drawing towards a close. I think it's really important with Blake to almost restore him, if I might be so bold, as a religious thinker, really. Certainly as a absolutely crucial in Christianity, post-Reformation, visionary, mystic, because of this element you were touching on there, that you know, we're the creature for whom our own existence is too small for us, if we regard ourselves as just finite and mortal, and if we do that, all sorts of terrible destruction comes about, born of frustration and jealousy and all the things, possessiveness, all the things that Blake tracks too. But you know, I think it's why the figure of Jesus is so significant in Blake, and when I'm thinking and trying to write about Blake, it's one of the things I try and hold in mind, because I think he can be sort of, people make raids on Blake. You know, they grab a bit of politics, which is beautifully expressed, and use that, or they grab a bit of aesthetics, creativity, you know, which is beautifully expressed, and use that, or in the psychedelic world, you know, a few phrases seem to carry some sort of resonance. But he's he is saying that it's, it is in the minute particulars, it is in the small moments, not the great dramatic moments that most truly matter, I think. And again, in Jerusalem, the Emanation and Giant Albion, it seems often that Jesus appears, this human form divine, the meeting of the finite and the infinite in this play of imagination, at the moments which are so often most intimate, most desperate. It's after the grandiosity is gone. Albion's lying on the rock of ages, or Jerusalem is saying, "What do I see now of the divine? I thought I saw, but is this just a sort of a shadow of immortality?" And so, in that way, to me, he's speaking to our moment too. If we dare, and I know that figures like Jesus and Christianity are very tricky things to talk about, but maybe that's one of the things that Blake wants us to wrestle with too, actually, that in our indigenous traditions in Europe, say, the context in which he was writing, there's something to be discovered by going back into that. Again, maybe that's been another theme in our conversation, the going into, not the trying to nostalgically recover.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll add to that because Blake is such a asystematic but holistic kind of thinker, like you can't really make a theory or a system of what he thinks, but at the same time, it seems like every part of Blake resonates with every other part. So I find it surprising and sad that the kind of radical tradition has seized on radical Blake, the socio-political activist, and the sort of mystical people who've gone for the mysticism, and the Jim Morrison people have gone for the crazy psychedelics. I think that really the amazing thing that he's showing us is a deeply interrelated universe. So this is the time where the religious has to be thought with the socio-political and with the sexual and all those things that Blake is taking together. I think unless we take all those things together, we're not really going to seize, and we're not really going to befriend Blake because he's going to be way beyond us. But more importantly, I think the machinery of thinking that has led us to this mess will carry on, because it depends on us separating all that stuff. Oh yes, you're religious, well that's your private belief, who cares about that? And politics, that's just a matter of protesting, and then sexuality, that's another thing. So he's saying you've got to see with this, in this fourfold way, that all those things are intimately connected into one another. So I think that part of Blake is waiting to be told. I really find it interesting what you say about the figure of Jesus. I'd have to think more about that, but certainly I would offer an open challenge with generosity to the readers of Blake not to separate those things. It's time to see it all. What does it mean when we try to see it and sense it and think it all together?
No, I find that very helpful. And again, I think it's quite evident in Blake, really, because in Blake, certainly in the later, epic poems, there's no individual with a sort of private life doing something mystical in their quiet corner. It's all like these great figures at the giants, Albion or Jerusalem, and it's all playing out, as Owen Barfield put it, at the level of the inside of the whole world, not just your private insight, inner life. Yes. And so that's such a good challenge, because it's actually precisely the way that Blake portrays it.
Absolutely. So he's kind of thinking of the future in that sense.
Yeah, it's hard though, isn't it? Because when you feel caught in the Eurozenic world, there's a sort of sense of needing to retreat, almost, just to sort of, in a way, survive. But the challenge is to step back into some. There's a teacher who I really like, Rupert Spira, and he sometimes says that William Blake is the tantric master of the West, and what he means by that is it's not this sort of Vedantic realization of the unity of all things, as it were, on a meditation cushion, but it is actually a stepping out into the world and realizing in the minute particulars the oneness of all things. And by, I suppose, the call is to awakening your own perception, becoming more aligned, therefore, with the wider expansive image, the prayer, the praise even, is that awakens Albion, and so that begins to restore things.
Yes.
I guess something in that kind of, you've got to work on yourself, but it's only so that you can catalyze that elsewhere, perhaps.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll conclude with I mean, you've said it absolutely beautifully. I think also something that he brings in is it's okay to wrestle. that it isn't this kind of suddenly I understand and my vision is eternal and I've got it all and I'm walking around like a saint. That actually, as he says, without contraries there's no progression, and opposition is true friendship, and there's this whole issue of mental fight. So actually you can wrestle with Blake too. I don't think he wants to be a nobody. I think he wants to lay down the doctrine. He is giving us the end of a golden string. He's opening all these doors, and the art of civilized wrestling, civilized mental wrestling, has been lost. We're so polarized now. You just got this idea and I've got that idea, and then we just fight about it on Twitter and it all degenerates. But actually the art of really entering the field together and wrestling with those things, which is what Plato was also suggesting with his kind of dialogical energy, I think that's a really Blakean thing. And that's an energy I think that's somewhat missing in contemporary culture.
No, I like that. His expression "wars of love" perhaps is another way that is captured. And then, of course, Albion at the end of Jerusalem, his restoration comes when he throws himself into the furnaces of affliction, and they become fountains of living water. So again, those stepping right into the heart of life. That's where the promise is. Hey, look, Valentin, it's lovely talking. I certainly have felt energized in the exchange, and I hope people listening in might have felt some of that as well. But I look forward to the next time.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure, Mark. Thanks a lot.